And then I want to say something else that elsewhere, but not in the economics course, elsewhere he says it's not going to be like that. The first people who will associate, according to Rudolf Steiner, are the producers. You know, the producers are the ones that have to get together so that when a product comes to the shop, for example, it's already affordable or it's already wanted. It's too late. You know, when you've overproduced or you produced in the abstract, there's nothing you can do. You know, all you're going to have to do as an entrepreneur is convince your customers they want something other than they came in for. So it's very important that he says elsewhere, not in those lectures, elsewhere, the place where associative working would begin is with producers who will make sure, and this is a hugely important topic, who will make sure they're not producing for the sake of their shareholders.
Yeah.
And when you come into that, now you're in a huge problem because you can go right back to 1815, believe it or not, when he identifies at the end of the Napoleonic Wars, he makes a very precise date, 1810, 1815. This time, at the end of the Napoleonic Wars, the financial markets or the money markets began to separate from the goods markets. And he identifies this and he says, now you have a process. Money starts to do business on its own account. People start producing things for the sake of a return to their shareholders, not because anybody needs it, right? And so when you come into a modern corporate life, you're touching on this huge historical event that resulted in 2008, to be very historically precise. He didn't say that, but I can say it now. Where in history something's happening, where the money markets are parting company with the goods market. They're trying to, his language, they're trying to emancipate themselves, and in fact they can't. But they will create a whole world of money doing business on its own account, of producing things that nobody asked for, but you need to produce them in order to generate return to shareholders. Well, that describes modern corporate life. You know, most people are investing. They're not really interested in what the company they've invested in has done. They're interested it makes a greater profit quarter on quarter, right? And those companies are overproducing almost by definition. They meet no needs except the need to generate a profit, because Milton Friedman said of these three, only one of them matters. So, you know, I've said a lot, but it's really important to take this, put Steiner in context, put all these ideas in context. And then if you're going to create what you might think is an association, everybody in there has to think associatively, which means they have to take their individual, their self-centeredness or their individual part in an organization and think of the whole world. And I'll end up with a very important for me example. I once flew from, it must have been Zurich to somewhere, meaning I flew on a Swiss Air. And in those, and I can't remember when it was, quite a while ago now. And then at that time, they gave every passenger a book. I think it's maybe called Flight 97. And it described everything that had to happen for this plane to take off. Everything that had to be in place, the food had to be on board, the fuel, everything that everybody from their different places, the manufacturer of the plane, the suppliers of food, the fuel, and the crew coming on board and the captain waking up, and they described everything that had to come to this one place where I could get on a plane. And then everything had to happen for me to go from here to there, air traffic control and I don't know what, right? And then how this flight was then closed down and it didn't exist anymore. It's just such an interesting thing. And it was all about synergies and so on. And of course, you know, if you look in the airline industry, it's trying hard to be lots of separate companies, but they are all, you know, whether it's the One World or the Star Alliance, you know, they're all grouping together to get the synergies. They daren't say to associate because they're trying to be, you know, self-centered capitalist organizations. But the reality of economic life is, you know, they have to work together. And so they won't use the word association, that they would say, we're exploiting our synergetic relationships, and you know, you can use it, invent what words you want. They're having to face the fact that you know, one part of an airline operation acting unto itself, like I'm going to send in the sandwiches after the plane's left, wrecks, the flight is now ruined. Whatever you do out of your self-interest or your individual skills, you're bringing it to a larger table, and its value is on the larger table. So if you bring your sandwiches after my plane's taken off, I'm certainly not going to pay you for them. So figure that out. And so if you come into modern economic life, I think it's much more important to understand Steiner in the context of what's happening underneath everything, despite this capitalist self-centered rhetoric. And then try and change your own rhetoric so that you're not any longer self-centered, but you're clear that you are making a contribution to a larger table, and your value, in fact, will come from doing this. So you're going to get more for your sandwiches if you arrive on time and they're fresh than if they arrive stale, or if they don't arrive on time. Your value will depend on how well you've served my needs, not on how important you think you are. And this is not difficult for a business person to understand, but it just means you find yourselves in the wide universe. And if people don't understand existentially in business, they will never understand what Steiner's talking about, and they will create all sorts of organizations which just have the same habit life inside them. So from this, you can see, I hardly ever talk about associations. I would talk about, what I do talk about is the right on corporation. It's a little book I wrote. A right on corporation is one that does what Richard Eales talks about. And Steiner might say, well, that's very associative what he's doing, so let's go with Richard Eales. And also, any business person, one can understand it conceptually, but in business, if you produce something you like, right, you're out of business. And again, with my wife's store, other stores like that I've been involved in, when I've advised people, I said, don't, if you like I give example of a cooperative I used to work for or work with. And I said, that's okay, you can be a cooperative, but be very careful, because, who's ultimately responsible? And so they had the system, different people in the cooperative ordered stuff for their store. And I said, that's okay if you want to do it that way. But when you buy stuff in, be very careful you're buying in what your customers want, not what you like. And the only way I'm going to get you to discipline yourself is if you buy something in and it doesn't sell, because in fact it wasn't what your customers, it's the ice cream you like to eat. That's fine, you can do that, but you have to buy all that ice cream at retail price. You mustn't say, okay, I'll pay the cost. This is not allowed. And it's a hugely disciplining thing in these cases I know. If you buy something in, you might convince yourself your customers want it, but often it's what you like. And so that's fine. But when it doesn't sell, you must buy it yourself at the retail price. So you will never then buy something again for your store that your customers don't want. And you'd be surprised how it's a simple little example, right? But if you produce for yourself, you're out of business by definition. And a lot of modern productive life has this problem. It knows perfectly well it's producing to produce a return to shareholders. It's not producing to meet any need. Look at the amount of cars parked in the car parks of automobile manufacturers, and all the effort made to move all this stuff, change a headlight, and you need another car just to keep this whole return to shareholders going. Not because we need another car, but I need to profit on another car. So I kind of even twilight the cars. They fall apart after a period, or whatever it might be. What Ralph Nader called planned obsolescence. That's a forgotten story, right? But planned obsolescence is absolutely embedded. This computer I'm looking at is going to, at some point, my computer, as anyone knows, it's 10 years old, and things are dropping off of it, or rather they're being twilighted by the technology. So it's, because it's a perfectly good computer, but the profit on it has already been shared 10 years ago. So those who are shareholders in Apple, it's an Apple computer, they're not happy. They're not happy until I buy a new one every year. So you have to come into this whole world, actualize it, And this would never happen if you produce for a market, not for yourself. And just on something like that, you can resolve the whole overproduction of the modern economy.
Yeah.
But everyone's going to have to change their understanding. Well, I could give another example, which I don't know if it ever exists, but from Steiner's ideas was, and it's another huge topic. When you have an organization, so come away from my wife's little shop and the more folksy examples to something like, maybe not as big as Boeing, but but a seriously large, seriously capitalized operation with a lot of people in it. Mostly that's a constructed of so-called workers and capitalists. That's the concept in the background. Technically, it isn't. It's constructed of a company with employees, and some of the employees are directors or managers, and others are on the shop floor, sort of story in a factory. Technically, they're all the same kind of thing, but we have this image of capitalists and workers. So we say we overlook the fact they're all the same. They're all employees, and they're organized to make a profit for the shareholders. Some of the employees get to be directors, and they get to tell the others how to, so some get to set everyone's wages, their own included, and then they set also the workers' wages. And you end up in this kind of construct of the manager, the directors, and the workers. But strictly speaking, they're all employees, but now they all derive their income. They're all employed. So one example he gives in car manufacture, this is 1922, so it's a bit strange. Well, it's not really, because it's Ford, Model T Ford time. And behind that, just that one example is Henry Ford. And who was this guy who invented mass production? And, huge things were going on in Ford with Henry Ford at that time, and Taylorism, and I don't know what was going on in the evolution of economic and financial and corporate development. So what he's saying there is, you've got the people who make the bits of the car, and you've got the entrepreneur who puts all the bits of the car together. So he's got a car. He uses a very specific example. The entrepreneur is putting together all the bits, and now he has a choice, this entrepreneur. He can either hire these people to make all the bits, or they can make the bits and sell him the bits. And this is a very powerful image, because if he hires them to make the bits, he's their employer. If they make the bits and bring the bits to market, they will know that if I bring the right-hand front door too late or the wrong shape for the other bit of the car that I'm not making, this is like the Flight 97 example, then I'm not going to make a sale with my door. So his image is, even in productive factory or industrial life, you could see the workers, so-called, as all self-employed, little self-employed people who individually sell not their labor, but the product of their labor. And they sell these individual bits to an entrepreneur who then has a car, which he then puts on the market. This is a very powerful example. If you apply this to industrial development, and you say this is the time of Taylorism, and the way, in the United States with Henry Ford, this rapid explosion of industrialization and the whole problem of how do you organize people, we forget this. At least I think a lot of people either forget or they're not aware of what a huge challenge this was to understand and get it right. And there's a lot of literature about this, obviously. And if you place Steiner's simple example in that context, there would be no image of a capitalist and a worker construct. It's just not in Steiner's mind, nor need it be, right? You have the entrepreneur who says to all the workers, you make a really good door, so sell me the door. And then we won't even be talking about wages. He hasn't even bought your labor. You don't even have to think about selling your labor, because you're selling me a door. So everything, the huge world that based on wages, buying and selling labor, which for Steiner is a complete illusion, is not necessary if every worker was to go self-employed, and then he'd be in the place of a producer having to meet a market. having to meet a need. And this would change the whole mindset of every so-called worker. And then the whole division we have between capitalists and workers would simply have gone from the universe. But you'd have to be self-employed. But there's issues there, and I'm not ashamed to bring all these complexities in because to do that you'd have to review income taxation. And in any country I know, when one says let's turn every worker into a self-employed person, the tax department says no way. Self-employed people are complicated enough, right? Because they're not good at their bookkeeping, because they get 2 years before they have to pay any tax, so it's not good for our cash flow. We like pay as you earn. We like to have the tax regularly every week or every month. We don't like have to wait for someone to send in his tax return late and have a year in which he has to pay it, because where's our cash flow? So when you start saying, as I do, imagine everybody who's a worker was self-employed. The first person who's not happy with that is the tax office. No way is that going to happen, right? And behind that is pay as you earn. Behind that is the state, who wants a permanent revenue stream based on the idea that I've bought and sold labor. So it's easy for me to say, and I'm self-employed and have been all my life, but I know from this very place what happens if you try and generalize the notion of self-employment. It also means every self-employed person has to take care of his own tax arrangements. Under pay as you earn, you are self-employed, but you've got a contract with your employer to calculate your tax and pay it before you ever see it. You get what's left over. So you have a contract. You never have to be aware of your tax profile. Your employer is doing that for you. Mm. So this may sound complicated, but just try and be self-employed. You have to be responsible for your capital, and it's even built into the conditions of the self-employment. Self-employment in most countries does not mean you have one client you work for. Self-employment usually entails 5 conditions minimum, which demonstrate that you have capital at risk. You set your own timetable. You use your own equipment. It's very, very precise, meaning you have to be at risk. You have to have your own balance sheet, super conscious. Plus, you never work 9 to 5 if you're self-employed. Well, you might work 9 to 5, but then you're going to work 5 to 9. And you never work 5-day weeks if you're self-employed, never. So when you go into this in detail, so many people don't want to know about this. They're happy to have someone else worry about their taxation, someone else generate their revenue stream. They just insist on Friday afternoon, I want it. And they're not necessarily responsible for how it happens. And so you just take this one example. If the whole world, per Steiner, was based on self-employment, there would be no capitalist worker construct in existence. And everything that's built on trade relations, not trade, on labor relations, labor market, all this unions, all this they just don't exist in his mind, because they wouldn't exist in an associative economy. They just wouldn't happen. And don't underestimate this. If Owen, whose name I can't remember, had thought like this when he created Harmony or New Lanark, Steiner makes this very clear. If he had thought like I'm describing 100 years before I speak, we wouldn't be in a world full of Marxism and socialism and all the complications this has created. It simply would never have happened. If Marx had gone to New Lanark, he would have written another book. Very simple. And if you make an image of how permanently divided the world is on this Marxist capitalist story, right into communist China and Russia, and the whole construct for 100 years is a society which is unnecessarily riven, because the economic life is predicated on a false understanding. So if you come into this kind of stories, really, if you put Steiner in context and make an image of what would happen if he was listened to, you have to take on board all this stuff. Write in your own biography, are you self-employed? Have you taken responsibility for your own tax computations? Are they correct? Do you understand the logic behind it? are you up to speed on, every individual who's listening to this can ask that question. And if you're not self-employed, I would say you're out of track with history, at least economic history, because you're not going to be individually able to manage your finances. And now we have a huge problem because the whole evolution of our times, especially technically in financial circles, it is assuming we are able to do this. It makes a huge assumption about our financial literacy and our ability to run our own affairs. But almost this is an assumption you kind of make at your peril, because nothing I'm describing as a way of understanding the world and organizing it will you ever find in an MBA or in a business studies course, even at age 16. There you will find a capitalist worker construct in all sorts of forms and all the things you have to do to make this impossibility work. Whereas if already it's in a business studies course, it said, do you understand what economic life is? It's you becoming clear what your skills are, what your destiny is, and placing them in service to other people's needs. If you began this as your trope, it's a better trope than the other one, the whole world would be different if you were taught this at 15 and on into business school. The only thing you have to do is become very clear what your specific contribution is and place it at the service of other people's needs, not at your service of your own need. Then we would have a totally, almost an associative starting point. But you're told, get your skills you need to serve yourself. That's what the whole business school world is. And therefore we shouldn't be surprised that we live in the mess we live in. So whether we ever get down this path, whether we ever arrive at a thing that we think Steiner would call an association, I doubt it. Because I think a lot of what he's describing is latent behavior and is implicit in like a corporation, which just does what Richard Eales does.
Yeah.
It can't do that if it's going to be self-centered, or if anybody in it is going to be self-centered. You won't find the worker happily seeing profits going off to the opera house if he thinks he's been underpaid. So first you've got to make sure that everyone in that is commensurated sufficiently for him to be happy. You've got to be sure that your shareholders are happy with the part they get and they're not going to get all of it. It's an easy idea that Richard Eales describes, but if you imagine all the players in that corporation, all the so-called stakeholders, they're all going to have to think associatively. They're not to be wanting a large chunk of the profit.
Yeah.
And this just to complete the Steiner story about the coming day. If the coming day failed, he was very clear why it failed. The mindset of those in it, people working in the companies, the people running the companies, there was the mindset of a capitalist organization or a capitalist worker construct. That's why it failed. They could not think associatively, they could not behave associatively, and that's why it failed. Nothing to do with finances, in fact. And so, I'm very insistent on all this, because we're wasting our time if we look at Steiner in a folksy context, and we don't look at, we don't put him up there with Taylor, get him on the macro level where his ideas really, really can be valued, and then see what you're up against if you want to bring his ideas into practice. And I know very, very, very few companies, also not in the Steiner movement, very few companies in the Steiner movement know anything about what I'm talking about. They're just normal organizations, normal in the profiteering sense. They may have rhetoric, but if you dig around in the details, how they're constructed and do they buy and sell labor and all this, you really can't tell the one from the other, even if they're owned by some kind of trust. Their operating modality is not so different from the company down the street. I just say that not to be negative, but just to be clear. Just to say you're an anthroposophical business or you have Steiner in your mind or something like this, that can just be mere rhetoric. To really get people, even people who know about Steiner, to change their economic modality, it doesn't just come from reading a lecture by Steiner.